Hello and welcome back to the third part of this Mari series. So in parts 1 and 2 we went through some of the sort of basic principles of Mari, and in this third part of this video I'm going to string some of that together and basically show you how I would texture an asset if it were in a production environment. So I've already actually textured the asset. I set myself a limit of about 2 hours to see what I could get and use the principles that we've already discussed so far, and any that we haven't I'm going to go over. So some of this footage is going to be sped up, and where I need to explain things I will, and where I don't need to I might cut things out for the sake of time. So starting off here, I've removed everything that we've already done and I've made a new project and just made some of my base channels. I've got my diffuse, I've got a metallic, I've got a spec roughness, and I've got a normal map. So personally, I like to use normals just because they display a little bit better inside of Mari. You could use bump or displacement to get a similar effect. So one thing that we haven't actually discussed yet is reference. So I'm using PureRef here, which is a free program you can get online, just to have my reference up at all times, keeping it on top of Mari, just for the sake of this video to kind of show what I'm doing. I'd usually have it off screen. Also, one really handy feature of the color picker inside of Mari is you can use the eyedropper when you open that, and I've just sampled that baby blue from this parking meter here. So I'm just setting up some base nodes. I'm using colors for the base color, and then I'm using constant values just to plug into the specular roughness, the metallic, and the normal I'm not going to worry about too much yet. So I'm just setting up some rough values to get this sort of painted metal that I'm seeing in my reference looking right inside of Mari. And then when I've got that, underneath that I wanted some exposed metal. So I found this really nice image of what I'm assuming is some sort of milk jug with a nice bit of patina and wear on it, but nothing too major. So I'll set that up next. However, I'm going to need a mask to define where I want the paint and where I want the metal. So what I've actually done is I've made a backdrop node elsewhere, and I'm going to set my mask up here, and you'll see why in a second. So I've got this new paint node. I'm using my little invert trick from the previous video just because it was a black paint node. You can't really see the wireframe nicely on that. So I just invert it so that it's white so that I can see the wireframe and just easily select the bits. And then making sure I've got my paint node selected, I'll right click, fill that with white, and then that will be my paint mask. And then I'll just delete the invert node afterwards because I don't need it anymore. It's just for viewing purposes. So after that, I'm going to use a new node to the later versions of Mari called the teleport node. And the teleport node is just a fantastic way to keep your scene really clean. You're going to see me using them a lot here. All you need to do is put down a teleport broadcaster, and then any teleport receivers in the scene can reference what's plugged into that. So that's why I actually put my mask off to one side, and I like to do this a lot so I can have all my masks together and I can quickly change them if I need to, and then using these teleport nodes, any changes gets pushed out to the rest of the scene. That's why I'm copying and pasting these teleport receivers, and so that one node is driving 3 different nodes in my scene, and this is why the node graph is so much more powerful than layers, because although you could kind of do that in layers, it was fiddly, and this is just clean. I love it. I can't get enough of teleport nodes. They are amazing. So now basically I've got this setup where I've got this one mask defining where there's paint and where there's metal. And so because of that, I can start using merge nodes to add different constants or different colors to define different properties of these materials. So for example, I've got a different spec for the metal, I've got a different spec for the paint. And obviously that's not overly complex, it's kind of similar to what we've been doing so far. But the beauty of having this mask off elsewhere in my node graph is I can now start making it a bit more complex. So on this reference, you can kind of see here, I've got these sort of little chips where the paint has kind of cracked away, and underneath you're getting some exposed metal. So what I can do is by multiplying on a tiled procedural, I can then start to expose a little bit of that metal underneath and get all this really nice detail fairly procedurally because I'm not actually having to hand paint anything at this point. So after a little bit of color correction on that tiled node and multiplying it on top, you can see I've got these tiny little chips, sort of like I'm seeing in the reference, and I can just play with that levels node to sort of bring it out a little bit more. So after that, this is great and all, but let's add a little bit of hand painted detail because it was looking a little bit procedural. So I'm going to actually use this cool rust texture I found from textures.com, and I'm going to project this onto a transparent paint node. Obviously, this is not a black and white image, so I'm going to need to make sure I use a hue saturation value node afterwards in HSV to desaturate it because a mask needs to be black and white, and this is obviously orange at the moment. So I'm just going to paint this around, and also you'll notice I'm painting onto transparency. You can't really have transparency in a mask either. It will just give you issues. So if you do end up using a transparent node for a mask, then just make sure you merge it on top of a white or a black constant afterwards so that there's no transparent data. But yeah, once I've got those 2 masks sort of added together, the procedural and the hand painted, I've got something that looks a little bit less CG. And considering the time it took, it looks all right. So I'm going to add a little bit more breakup to this blue paint. We haven't discussed the triplanar node yet. We've just talked about tiled projection. So triplanar basically projects one of the images from your image manager along the X, the Y, and the Z axis. So the front, the side, and the top. And it's a really great way to project things like bricks and stuff like that, because it's not based on your UVs, so it's based in just world space rather than UV space. And it can just be a nice way to stop, if you don't have great UVs, it can kind of fix that. I've used that way too many times on bad UVs at different jobs, but ignoring that, it's just a nice way to add further breakup. So I'm doing that with one of these. It's actually the Substance procedural sort of drips. I really like their procedurals, so I often use them as a mask to change the hue, saturation, and value of the bit where there are sort of drips. So just making it a little bit darker, a little bit more saturated, and combining that together with a merge node. And that's just a really nice way to add a little bit of breakup. You'll see me using HSV with a mask just to add breakup all the time. It's one of my go-tos. And then because where there's sort of dirt on the surface, it would probably also affect the specular because dirt is a build-up and it will probably be a little bit rougher. Then I'm just going to use that same mask and sort of drag that down into my specular working area, as it were, and then also just change the levels of the specular there, just so it feels a little bit dirtier and drier in those parts too. And again, that's one of the beauties of the node graph, sharing information across. I could use a teleport node here. Just because it's so close, then sometimes I don't bother with those because you can get way too many in a scene. If I'm going from one side of a scene to another, I will absolutely use this teleport, but for something this close, it doesn't really feel necessary. And then again, beauty of the triplanar is I can just try plugging in some different textures, see what looks better, if something matches the ref a bit nicer, but I actually end up sticking with what I had to begin with. So yeah, one thing that we haven't actually looked at yet is the normal map and how I go about doing that. So basically with a normal map, all I'm doing is setting it up as if it was a bump map, and then I'm using the height to normal node inside of Mari to turn that into a normal map and just plug that into the normal value of the shader. The reason I do that, I've just always found that visualizing normal data in the viewport through the shader is a lot nicer looking than the bump is. And so yeah, if you wanted to actually export that bump data without any normal stuff, you could just disable that height as normal node or not use it at all. But for visualizing it, I just always throw that on, and I don't visualize displacement data through the shader either because it's too slow. And because a bump map is white where you want it to push out, black where you want it to push in, actually my paint mask works perfectly for this, that I can then convert into a normal map, because where it's white, the paint is sitting on top and it just makes the scratch metal underneath look like it's sitting inwards a little bit. So yeah, I'm just using that mask. Again, sharing data is what the node graph is made for. So I've got a base I'm fairly happy with. Now I'm going to start looking at my reference and start identifying pieces of detail that I can sort of add to it. So I'm seeing on this metal, I've got this really nice sort of worn effect over it. So I'm using a rust texture that looks fairly similar, using that as a tiled node. And I'm just going to do some hue saturation values, some sort of color grading to it, and add that detail on top of the base color that I've already picked. You can see here I'm using backdrop nodes just to help keep everything kind of organized. I've got my base values and then the details I'm adding on afterwards. So yeah, just using an HSV node here to kind of grade that rust texture, merging it on top. I can change the opacity of how much I want to merge that on top. And then I'm also seeing some white scratches on this reference. So I've just added a few of those, and I'll do the same with some larger scratches as well, like I'm seeing on the reference. These days, I'm trying to work as procedurally as possible, just especially when you're in a production environment. You can get notes that change things all the time, and it just means that you can make quick adjustments on the fly. The beauty of this setup is I can quickly look at the shader, see how it's all looking, and start balancing the values of my different maps to hopefully get something that appears a little bit more like the reference. So this is looking a little bit dark, so maybe I'll make some adjustments to that. Yeah, it's as if I knew I was going to do it. Yeah, just kind of bring that up and get it matching the reference a little bit. And yeah, if the director turned around and was like, actually, we want the color on this to change, we don't want it to be blue anymore, I can really quickly change that. Whereas if I'd painted that all down, baked it down, I wouldn't be able to change it quite as easily. So one thing that we haven't actually spoken about inside of Mari is importing data into your paint node. So here I'm going to bring in some bakes for this mesh. So I've baked out like my ambient occlusion, my curvature. So to do that, you need to right click on a node and then go File, Import, and you can import UDIM textures into that paint node. So here I've set up a paint node for a tight AO, for a broad AO, and also for a curvature. So I'm just setting those up. Obviously, Substance is kind of the standard for baking these days, so I'm bringing them in from there. But if you had bakes from like ZBrush or anything like that, you can use that. And often Mari is kind of the center program that you're bringing in a lot of different paint data into. So yeah, you're not necessarily using just Mari, but it is kind of the home base for all of that. So when I've got all those set up, then I can pop down teleport nodes and use these bakes around my scene where I need to. Which is perfect timing because I actually want to use the curvature for the glass on this object. So there's a bit of an issue here though. No texturing program really handles opacity well, so I'm actually not going to be able to set this up in the shader and demonstrate it inside of Mari. So really what I'm going to need to use is my own texturing knowledge to make sure that the maps I create here are going to be correct for Arnold, for Houdini, for Redshift, whatever renderer you're using, so that I can plug them out of the box into my shader there and it all works correctly for the glass material. So I'm going to be using transmission inside of Arnold. So what I'm actually going to do is create a channel here. I'm going to call it opacity. You can call it whatever you want because the name doesn't really matter, but whatever I plug into here needs to work for my shader. So I'm going to create a black and a white channel, and where it's white, that's going to be an opaque surface, and where it's black or it's not completely white, that's going to be slightly transparent. And then I can set up, using those values, a map that works inside of Arnold to make the eyes and the chest piece and whatever else I want be transparent and glass. So yeah, fast forward, and I've done exactly that. Using the curvature map, I've made it a little bit broken up around the edges, a little bit brighter so that it's slightly less transparent around there for a nice bit of breakup. And I'll add that to the specular roughness as well, so it's a bit dirtier around the edge. So I've hidden the pieces in the geo that are going to be glass by pressing H on my keyboard whilst I have them selected. You can also go to selection, hide selected to do that, and then you can unhide anything via that menu as well. And so the pieces underneath the geometry under that glass, I actually want to be sort of like an LED, LCD sort of screen. So I've got some reference here of what I'm hoping it to look like. So once again, I'm going to make another mask, put it into a teleport node, and then I can just kind of push that out to the rest of my scene where I need it. And I've got a nice little backdrop here. I'm going to set up the base values as I've been doing for everything so far, the metal, the paint, the glass. And yeah, so I've made this square texture. It's a really, really small thing just inside of Photoshop with a little bit of blur on the edge. And I'm going to just tile that really, really small to sort of emulate the square diodes or whatever they are on an LCD system. LCD? LED? I don't know. I'm not an engineer, I'm a texture artist. And then underneath that, what I'm going to do is I will add the sort of things that I want to be on that screen. So I'm going to sort of layer that on top. And I'll make an emissive texture from that afterwards. So I'm going to add eyes, I'm going to add some text. In my head, this is sort of like a robot that would help with your parking. I'm calling it Parking Bot 4000 in my head. So I'm just going to take those hand-painted eyes, multiply on top that grid pattern that I've used, set a teleport node so that I can access that data elsewhere. And then I'm going to make a new channel, call it emissive. Again, on this one, the name doesn't really matter. I just know it needs to plug into my shader inside of Arnold. And the good thing about keeping this black and white here is I can use this as a mask rather than deciding the color inside of Mari. I can set all of that up in the shader, and then I can change it when I'm rendering if I wanted it to be blue, if I wanted it to be yellow, and you'll see me doing that as I go later on. I'm not baking any of that in here. I can make the changes on the fly later on. So I'm just going to add some decals now onto the body here. I'm doing this into a transparent paint node, and because my image manager images have transparency in them, then it's painting nicely just on top of everything. I don't have to worry about masking anything out like that. These are some that I got off Gumroad, but you could, if you're making them yourselves, just make sure they're PNG with transparency enabled, or TIFF, or another sort of image format that allows transparency, and you'll be golden. So final few details, I'm going to add some rust by just placing down a tiled texture using one of the rust textures I've actually already used. And then just using the ambient occlusion bake that I already had in my scene, I'm just going to use a levels node on that and use that to define a really tight area just in the crevices of this mesh to add some rust, and then just add, using that mask, add it to my other channels as well, so it's a bit rougher in those areas too. And the final tweak I want to make on this is I'm just going to select a few parts of the shell and just change the color ever so slightly in those areas just by making a new paint node for the mask, filling it, and then using a color node just to change the color of that painted area. Super simple stuff. So yeah, that kind of brings me to the end of how I textured this robot. Again, it took me about 2 hours. In a production environment, I take a lot longer on an asset. If you're working on something for your showreel, you should probably take a lot longer on an asset. But I just wanted to demonstrate that the techniques that we've learned in part 1 and 2 of this video can be used to quite quickly build up something that looks really nice inside of Mari. So yeah, that that brings this series to a close. I do recommend doing a lot more research about Mari whilst you're learning along the way. There's a lot of fundamental concepts out there just to do with texturing in general that we haven't been able to touch on. It's just the reality of it being quite a difficult and complex topic. I can't sum that up in 3 20-minute videos. But once I've exported my textures, I can get them inside of Maya or whatever render engine I'm using, set up my shaders really quickly, and without any color correction to those textures, we have this. Quite a solid first pass, really. I know what I would change if this were an asset at work. There isn't enough breakup on the metals, for example. The glass breakup that I added just isn't really showing. You can sort of see it as that light goes round the eyes there. But yeah, there's just a few bits that I would change going forwards. But I've taken up enough of your time, so I'm not going to talk about them too much here. Thanks so much for joining me during these 3 parts. Hopefully you're feeling a little bit more comfortable with Mari if you came at it as a brand new beginner. You might not feel super comfortable with it, and to that, all I can say is that makes sense. It is a complex piece of software, but when you get there with it, honestly, it's so much fun to texture in, and you can make really, really cool things, and isn't that what VFX is all about? Okay, my name's been Michael Wild. Thank you so much for joining me on these videos, and best of luck with your Mari journey.